recent developments in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Before I get to that, I'd just like to talk about Kurdish history and their presence in the Middle East and their presence in the region. So the Kurds span four nations that exist today: Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. Each of these states have large Kurdish populations, and there are minorities in each of these states, actually. In Turkey, you have there are about 20% of the population, about 15 to 20 million Kurds in Turkey alone. In Syria, they're also a minority, 3 million Kurds. In Iraqi Kurdistan, where the referendum was held, about 5.5 million Kurds estimated. And in Iran, 10 to 12 million Kurds. And all these, they were promised a state after the World War I, but because of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Syria and Iraq were established. The Kurdish aspirations for an independent state was ignored by then leading powers, the British and the French. So just so you know, many of these states disputed the referendum largely because of their own Kurdish populations. This played a major role. Fast forwarding to the developments recently, just before that, the Kurdistan regional government had many disputes with the central government in Baghdad, even before 2014 when ISIS rose in the region. Baghdad, after the Constitution was implemented in 2005, they did not follow the Constitution as they proclaim to follow it now because of the referendum that was held. Baghdad held 17% of the Kurdistan budget that was agreed upon between both sides. Baghdad did not allow U.S. weapons to go into the Kurdistan region. They would hold it at the airport, which would delay the fight against any opposition forces and any terrorist organization like ISIS. Baghdad also did not pay certain salaries that was agreed upon between the central government and Erbil, the Kurdistan region government. So this is a few of many disputes that could not be agreed upon between the two sides. And then you had the rise of ISIS as well in 2014. Now, with the ISIS war, the Kurds, when ISIS came in, they took over Mosul. Mosul has many minorities, especially Christian minorities, Yazidi Kurdish minorities, and Sunni minorities as well. Now, the Sunnis have always been they've been the victims of revenge since the Maliki government after 2005. So the Sunnis felt as if they're being targeted, especially with the Maliki government that was in charge from 2005 up until the rise of ISIS. Now, during the ISIS war, the Kurds did manage to fill in the vacuum where the Iraqi army fled. The Iraqi army, when they did flee, they left many U.S. military equipment on the ground in the hands of ISIS. But the Kurds did manage to, over time from 2014 to 2017, just until a few weeks ago, to gain control of all these territories, which are also disputed. That's very important because disputed means both the central government and the Kurdish government claim it's theirs. So that includes Mosul, that includes Khanaqin near Baghdad, that also includes Kirkuk, which is a very oil-rich province. The Kurds also took in over 2 million refugees and IDPs, and most of these are Sunni Arabs. And this was also part of the dispute as well. That's why the Kurds had to call for an independence referendum, because they felt like Baghdad was not doing its part in helping the Kurds, even though they're taking in many of the refugees. So the Kurds were they took in about 1.8 IDPs from Iraq and also over 300,000 refugees from Syria. And Peshmerga forces were able to gain all these territories, the disputed territories, when the Iraqi army fled. They also were backed during this time. They were backed by the United States and international coalition to push back ISIS further down, and also they were part of the reclaiming of Mosul, ISIS capital in Iraq. Leading up to the referendum, which was declared, I believe it was June 2017, Masoud Barzani, the president of the Iraqi Kurdistan, he called for the referendum. Now, the referendum, as Sarah said, was very problematic. The Kurds did not receive any support from regional alliances as well as international community. The United Nations Security Council was against it. The United States was against it. The EU was against it. Of course, Iran, Iraq, and even Syria was against it. Syria having no legitimacy, Assad having no legitimacy, they even spoke out against the Kurdish referendum. So, but Barzani went ahead anyways. Now this created a lot of problems internally because the Kurds felt like we don't have any support from the outside. How are we going to defend ourselves when the backlash does come through after the referendum? The result, the Kurds did go through the referendum. About 93% voted yes, with a 72% turnout rate. This included disputed territories, including Kirkuk. Kirkuk is majority Kurdish. Then you have Sunni Arab minorities as well as Turkmen minorities as well. And it's heavily, Kirkuk is a rich oil province. I believe Kirkuk makes up about 3% of the world's oil, just Kirkuk province alone. And the Kurds have historically believed they've historically believed that it's their Jerusalem, that Kurdistan cannot be declared, or we cannot have a Kurdish state without including Kirkuk within the future state. So after the referendum was declared, Iran closed its borders. The Iraqi Vice President Maliki, who is very close to the Islamic regime in Iran, even stated out publicly that we do not want a second Israel inside or near Iraq or near Iran and Iraq. So because the Kurds have a strong relationship with the Israeli government, and historically they've been close as well. There are two persecuted minorities in the region, and the Kurds are Muslim, but they don't see this as a difference. They actually think this is they have common enemies and common interests in the region as well. And also important to note that Israel was the #1 purchaser of Kurdish oil. That was largely taken from Kirkuk. So they've had economic ties, diplomatic ties. There are talks they've had discrete military ties as well. But this can't come out public largely because it'll be seen as Iran says it, as an Israeli project or of some sort, which the Israeli government doesn't want to harm the Kurds, and the Kurds don't want to harm themselves because at the end of the day, that's their neighbors, unfortunately. So the Iraqi government and the Turkish government, after the referendum, conducted military drills along the Kurdistan region border. The international flights were banned into Kurdistan region. Airspace was closed. The Iranian Kurdish borders were also closed. So these were all part of a blockade plan by Iran, influencing the Iraqi government with the influence of Turkish government of opposing the Kurdish referendum results. And again, like I said before, this is all because of their own largely Kurdish minorities, because they fear that if we allow the Kurdistan region of Iraq to declare independence, that we're next. And as we've witnessed in Kurds in Syria, they've been doing just that and building a future Kurdish state, despite them not publicly recognizing it. So after the referendum, the very recent developments in Kirkuk, it began in Kirkuk. The oil-rich province was taken over with an alliance between the the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and the Iraqi Army. The Popular Mobilization Forces is largely made up of Shiites, and they are backed and funded by the Iranian government. And they are constitutionally legal under the Iraqi constitution. So any human rights violations, anything that they do, is under the responsibility of Haider Abadi, the Iraqi prime minister. Now, the problem with this is that the PMU receives weapons from Iraq as well. Now, who gives Iraq these weapons? The United States. So, in essence, the United States is giving weapons to an Iranian proxy through Iraq. But because they are constitutionally illegal under the Iraqi constitution, the United States can't fully withhold their support to the Iraqi government. And that was largely why the United States spoke out against the Kurdish referendum, is because they wanted Abadi, who was seen as more of a moderate compared to the previous government of Maliki, to stay in power and win elections. I believe it's being held in May, so the Iraqi elections. They were afraid that another Maliki himself or a Maliki-type individual would replace Abadi because he looked weak. The Kurds called for independence. They lost large swaths of territory to ISIS. So they were trying to basically hold Iraq together. Although it is a failed state, the United States is doing everything in its own power to hold Iraq together, and also not fully withdraw from Iraq, because once the United States fully supports the Kurdish backing for an independent state, they have given the green light to Iran to fully come in, and that's against U.S. interests. Iran has expanded its influence over Iraqi political environment and their military after the withdrawal of U.S. troops in 2011 under the Obama administration, which was seen as a failed policy by many in Iraq, actually, even by the Kurds. The Kurds warned the Obama administration not to withdraw, and actually Barzani even warned the United States that there is a group that is getting stronger and getting bigger in Kirkuk, Saddam's hometown, and this group happened to be ISIS, which they came about in 2014. ISIS was mostly ex-Baathists, the Sunni minorities, who felt that they were being targeted by the Shiite government, which is the Shiites hold 60% of the population in Iraq. So the PMU managed to take over Kirkuk, and all this while the United States stood idly by. Donald Trump was asked a question during a press briefing, and he stated that he will not take sides. This was unfortunate. The Kurds felt betrayed. They felt that they should have had the support of the United States, because the Kurds did lose over 2,000 Peshmerga forces during the fight against ISIS. The Kurds did regain territories back from ISIS, which Iraqi military failed to hold. The Kurds had over 10,000 wounded Peshmerga forces. So all this, and then at the end, the United States felt that it was more important to back a Abadi government rather than support a Kurdish state. The Kurds felt that the U.S. alternative of postponing the referendum was not the right approach. They were not satisfied with it because the United States did not provide a clear vision for a future Kurdish state. The Kurds experienced the empty negotiations that went on between Baghdad and Erbil since 2005, since the implementation of the Iraqi constitution, and the disputed territories under Article 140 of the Iraqi constitution states that provinces and regions such as Kirkuk has to be solved, and the Iraqi government has ignored this call to solve these disputed territories because they know at the end the result is that the Kurds would gain these regions back, because these are largely Kurdish populations, areas, and it was Arabized during the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. They would pay Sunni minorities to move up north to fill in the gap, basically, to fill in the cities with Arabs and push out the Kurds. So the Kurds, since then, since October 16th, have lost all the territories they've gained from all the territories they've regained from the fight against ISIS. That's about over 50. There's estimates. It's over 50% for sure. So over 50% of Kurdistan region is no more. Unfortunately, from all the way near Khanaqin to Kirkuk to Mosul province and the Niwa provinces, and even just yesterday, the borders between Iraqi Kurdistan and Syrian Kurdistan. And this was all in agreement between the Iraqi government and the Turkish government as well. Again, fearing their own Kurdish populations and fearing the future connection and the future unity of a Kurdish state. They've lost 70% of their economy as well. So most of the Kurdish region, the Kurdistan region relies on oil. All that oil came from Kirkuk, and they were able to sell this oil independently through a pipeline from Kirkuk to Sihan port in Turkey. That was 70% of the Kurdish economy. So the question is now, how will you feed your people? How will you pay their salaries? How will you pay the Peshmerga forces? Kurdistan is basically landlocked. They have no access to sea. They have no ports, and they were heavily. Masoud Barzani deeply miscalculated this call that he was going to rely on Turkey to continue the sale of oils, but unfortunately, Turkey, fearing its own Kurdish population again, made a deal with Baghdad, stopping the flow of oil and the sales of oil, and also all the revenue that comes in from Kirkuk is put into a Turkish bank, Halk Bank, and the Turkish government withheld that money as well. So the Kurds weren't able to pay the salaries to the people, and I think this month's salaries is being delayed as well. So all this is basically, in essence, Iran's strong influence over Iraq. It's part of the Shiite bridge that Iran is attempting to build. It's part of, and the people the suffering are the minorities. So when Iran has no business up in northern Iraq, most of the population lies below Baghdad. 60% of the population lies there, and they have plenty of oil as well. But the population in the north are Sunnis, are Chaldeans, are Assyrians, are Christian Assyrians, are Yazidi Kurds, are Kurdish people, and they are the ones essentially suffering, and they are fearing another ISIS, because the PMU has been known to loot houses, to push out communities and burn down villages. In Kirkuk, I'm from Kirkuk. I recently spoke to my family actually in Kirkuk just last week, and many of the Kurdish families fled. Over 900,000 Kurds, 800,000 Kurds fled Kirkuk just the day after the PMU start entering Kirkuk, largely because they were afraid of the retaliation they would receive, because the Kirkukis were involved in the referendum. They did vote yes they voted yes for the referendum. Over 85%, I believe, voted yes in Kirkuk. So they felt as the PMU and the Iraqi army would seek revenge against Kurds for attempting to break away from the rest of Iraq. And they were afraid for their women as well, because the PMU has been known to rape women and attack women. So it's basically ISIS 2.0. Just this time, this is a Shiite group where ISIS was a Sunni group. And that's how the PMU came about as well. The PMU, because they were going against the Sunni expansionist ideology, where the Shiites felt as if they had to retaliate. So what the PMU has done is cut a deal with certain factions of Kurds inside Kirkuk. That's how they were able to come into Kirkuk. The Kurdistan region is largely led by two families, the Masoud Barzani family, the Barzani family, and the Talabani family. They both hold separate Peshmerga forces, and their numbers are large. They're about 150,000 each, Peshmerga forces. Kurdistan does not have a united military, which is one of the biggest faults and biggest reasons why Kurdistan was able to be lost all these territories. That was the main reason. I don't personally see this as a total loss, as a long-term loss, as a permanent loss, because at the end of the day, these regions that were taken over by the PMU, by the Iraqi government, are disputed territories. So they're still unresolved. Now, the Iraqi government might have control of it currently, but they still have to go back and implement the constitution, agree on Kirkuk, especially Kirkuk, agree on provinces, regions within Mosul as well. So this is not, but it's definitely a political defeat. I don't see this as a military defeat at all. The Peshmerga forces are well known for their fighting abilities, and it was simply a deal cut by political parties within Kurdistan after the unfortunately failed referendum because the Kurds weren't ready internally. There was a lot of disputes within the two families, between different political parties, the opposition parties, which weakened the Kurdistan region and were not able to defend themselves when the enemies decided to attack. And this shouldn't have been a surprise. Kurdistan's enemies have always attempted to divide and conquer the Kurds, unfortunately, and the Kurds have always taken that bait. And it's naturally the Kurds in Kirkuk and Soleimani region, which are closer to the Iranian border, tend to go closer to Iran. The Kurds in Erbil and Duhok and Zakho, the Barzani regions, tend to have closer relations with Turkey. So, and both the Turks and the Iranians have been able to successfully use the Kurds, pit them against one another to push their own national interests and personal agendas, such as Iran's expansionist agenda of using these disputed territories, of gaining access through Syria, and gaining eventual access to the Mediterranean Sea. This is not only a threat to the Kurds in Iraq, it's a threat to Kurds in Syria as well, because they have to cross through the Iraqi-Syrian border. This is a threat to U.S. interests, and also Israel, because that's their eventual goal, is to be that much closer to the Israeli border, which they have Assad support. They have Hezbollah there, and the main goal at the end of the day is to get to the Mediterranean and get to those ports.
All right. As the moderator, I'm going to take the liberty to ask the first question. Yeah. Can you tell us, first of all, the role of Qasem Soleimani, who he is, and how he intervened to make this a little bit more problematic?
Yeah, definitely. Qasem Soleimani is he's seen as basically the grand strategist of this Iranian expansionist agenda. Many leaders in the region do fear him. That's what he's known for. He's the leader of the Quds Force, and he's known as the person who put the PMU together and in Iraq. So he has a lot of power. He has a lot of wealth. He's been seen in Iraq. He's been seen in the Kurdistan region. He's been seen in Syria. He's been seen in Lebanon. So it's said that wherever he's seen, he's conquered. So that's the kind of influence that he has. And very important player here. He was actually in the Kurdistan region days before the Kirkuk was taken over. And it's not confirmed, but Kurdish officials have said that Qasem Soleimani visited us, and that he threatened that he would take over all of Kurdistan if Kurds did not withdraw from Kirkuk. So Kurds took this seriously. Unfortunately, the Kurds had no choice but to take this seriously because they didn't have the backing of the United States. The United States is too caught up in keeping Abadi in power. So Soleimani is everywhere, and he's been known as he was the one who did this at the end of the day. Yeah, unfortunately. So that's a great question. Let me answer that with the ending first. So currently Baghdad controls these areas. They are disputed territories, as I said before. Will Erbil be able to control it in the future? That's part of the implementation of Article 140 within the Iraqi constitution, that these issues have to be resolved, which the Maliki government ignored largely, again, because most of these regions contain Kurdish populations that oversee the Sunni Arab minorities and the other minorities. So Erbil should be able to regain these territories in the future. It should be done politically through dialogue. It's unnecessary to have military confrontations, although I feel it will lead to a military confrontation, as we've seen, because the reason why this was implemented in the Constitution was to avoid a military confrontation. But Iraq instead used the PMU with its Iraqi security forces. By the way, that they worked together during the fight against ISIS to push back Kurds once ISIS was defeated. So they saw an opening, this was the chance, and they took it. So the future of these areas and these territories are disputed until they're resolved through dialogue, not military confrontation. And as I've said before, the greatest threat to Iran's expansion, it's not the Kurds. Yes, the Kurds are losing, and they're being pushed back from attaining their aspirations for a state, but the biggest threat is against Israel. This is what Iran's goal is to get closer to Israel. And it's in Israel's interest to back the Kurds, because this is a buffer. This is the Kurds can prevent this land bridge that Iran is desperately trying to build, and they're successfully building, unfortunately. Nobody is standing in their way. Iraq is not standing in their way. Turkey is not standing in their way. They have the support of the Assad regime. They're going under the territories which the Kurds control in Syria. So, and the Kurds in Syria are backed by the U.S., and they're not getting in the way. So the biggest threat is towards Israel. And yes, Mount Sinjar, as you mentioned, which Kurds say Shingal, that's where the Yazidis fled in 2014 in Mosul province. Yeah, that was the region where Saddam Hussein used Scud missiles to attack Israel when he was in power. And unfortunately now that same region is controlled by the PMU once again. So it's not to say it's not going to happen again. Israel has every right to defend itself, and for that they should back the Kurds 100%. It's in their interest, and it's in the United States' interest as well. So my original thought was that Kurdistan should be attained through the Kurdistan regional government first, and then it would create a domino effect throughout the region, because we've seen Kurds in Syria successfully push back ISIS, regain historical territories while including minorities. They're not Kurdifying these regions. They're not forcing any sort of ideology in this region except local ruling and local councils. So the Kurds should not accept independence is a goal. So the Kurds should not accept anything less, but the Kurds also have to be practical. This referendum, I was actually the biggest critic of this referendum because it was not practical. I felt we had to strengthen ourselves internally in order to defeat the external threats. And this was proven when the PMU and the Iraqi army and Iranian government and Turkey and even Syria attempted to blockade us and put sanctions on us and threatened us. Erdogan even said that when you're sleeping, we'll come in at night, so don't declare independence. So these are the kind of threats, unfortunately, these are our neighbors, but Kurds should not accept anything less than independence. It is a goal, but we also have to be practical. Until we solve our interests internally, until we solve our disputes internally, I think this will be, it will be very tough. So Kurdish Jewish history dates back thousands of years. I'm not very informed. I know I've read a lot of information on that, but I could tell you that Kurdish Jewish history and Kurdish Israeli history has gone, we can take it back to after the declaration of the Jewish state of Israel in 1951, where hundreds of thousands of Kurds were pushed, were being threatened, Kurdish Jews were being threatened, and Iraqi Jews were being threatened because they were being targeted after Israel was declared. The Kurds helped the Israeli government transport and transfer these Jews, the Kurdish Jews, to Israel successfully. And ever since, they've held discreet, under-the-table military ties, intelligence sharing. And there's a large Kurdish community inside Israel as well. That numbers anywhere from 150 to 200,000 Jewish Kurds who openly and proudly support their Jewish religion while celebrating their Kurdish culture as well, openly and on the streets. I was actually in Israel this past summer, and I've met a few Kurdish Jews as well, and they still have that tie to Kurdistan, and they still have the aspiration of going back to Kurdistan. And even if they don't go back, they still proudly support and support a Kurdish state, and as do the Jews as well, the Israeli Jews. So the relationship is very deep. Throughout with the referendum, Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu was the only international figure, and Israel was the only state to openly support a Kurdish state. The Kurds welcomed this. Iran obviously was against this. They saw this as Israeli agenda, but this attempt to say it's an Israeli agenda is very offensive to Kurds, because Kurds have always fought for a Kurdish state long before any support was given. I mean, since the Sykes-Picot in 1916. So this attempt to threaten Israel through using the Kurds was seen as a kind of a cover-up for Kurdish independence. So yes, this is my favorite question because they still have their own forces. The Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, led by the late Jalal Talabani, who recently passed away, was also the first Kurdish president of Iraq. And then you have Masoud Barzani's forces. Very split, very tribal. Unfortunately, they each hold over 100,000 forces. They hold vast amounts of territories, and they hold oil fields, and they have different alliances as well. So, like as I said before, the Barzanis are closer to Turkey and Erdogan, and the Talibanis are closer to Iran. And historically, it's always been the same. This is the biggest obstacle to Kurdish independence to this day. It's been the biggest, and will always be until the Kurds decide to unite. The people are ready. It's not the people. It's the two families that are ruling Kurdistan. Unfortunately, this has been a huge obstacle. We've seen this in the parliament. We've seen this in the Peshmerga forces against the fight against ISIS. We've seen this internationally. There's always been that split, and this is what led to the fall of the disputed territories. Is that faction, a wing within the PUK, cut a deal with the central government. They cut a deal with the central government. This was opposed by Baghdad. This was opposed by Barzani's and the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party. but everybody was looking out for themselves in a way. The PUK faction felt as if it was not worth it to sacrifice our forces, while Barzani's forces are far away or have retreated. So they don't have a solid Kurdish. The people do have a solid Kurdish identity and solid Kurdish agenda, if you will. But unfortunately, the parties that are ruling have personal interests, have alliances that they have to satisfy. So the biggest thing Kurds could, those in the international community, Jews, Americans, could do is to help create a democratic Kurdistan internally, because long term, this is what will push back Iranian influence. The Kurds are broken inside right now. They're divided inside right now. This is our reality. Unfortunately, we're very weak inside. Our forces are strong, our Peshmerga forces, but what the United States could do, what Israel could do, is unite, help implement democratic institutions, help implement the parliament. Parliament was closed for 2 years since 2015. Barzani's term was over in 2013. He extended it by 2 years again, and then he extended it again by 2 years. This was opposed by the opposition. Parliament members were barred from entering the capital city. The opposition forces opposition political parties were barred from entering the capital city. Kurdish oil was being sold to Turkey independently, but it was not being invested back into the people. It was not feeding the people. There's no accountability and transparency. Billions have been lost, unfortunately. So helping build long-term institutions that can withstand these threats. And that comes with first unifying these two Peshmerga forces. They tend to follow the leaders and the families' plans rather than a Kurdish plan. When it's an outside threat, of course, but once all that settles down, the unity goes away. The ISIS brought the Kurds together very heavily. They were very united, which was great. But then once ISIS was defeated, as we've seen, the Kurds started splitting up again and being lured into these two different sides of Iran and Turkey. So United States, the best strategy for the United States is to help implement a strong democratic Kurdistan inside, push for the institutions to be upheld, and also keeping a presence there as well. That's very important. And Israel could do the same thing. Rather than just saying Kurdistan, we support Kurdistan, because the Kurds, you can support Kurds all you want, but the Kurds aren't united inside for you to keep pushing that. They're not ready when the call is there. Yeah, definitely. Again, Barzani Talabani family rule Kurdistan. They split the Kurdistan region in half. So the Barzani family controls the capital province, Erbil, and the capital city, Erbil, and they hold most of the positions in government. They hold the presidency. But recently, Barzani just stepped aside. That's the latest news, is that because his term ended in 2013, it was extended in 2015, and again extended in 2015 to 2017. Elections were supposedly held November 1st in a couple of days. He stepped aside because of the failure of the referendum, because of the losing of territories and resources. So they're split. They control half of Kurdistan, and the other family controls of the other half. And this is, again, the biggest obstacle Kurds have, is that the people end up suffering because of the internal disputes, unfortunately. And this is, again, the United States should help lead a government that will implement these institutions, help the opposition forces as well.